a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages audio journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, scouring ancient sagas and other testaments to the way of life in times long past, and of course, those things left to time in the form of stone worked by human hands. Joining me are a couple of experts in stone, but very different fields, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Jason, you here in the Carolinas like I am, you may have experienced some adverse weather recently. I know I did. How are you, sir?
Oh, we're doing just fine. You know, we've been through this many times here in Charleston, but for once, it went a little bit further left, and of course it went up to North Carolina, and we just hated to see that because, you know, here in the coastal areas, Florida as well, you know, as tragic as these storms can be, we certainly are a little bit more prepared. The landscape is a little more forgiving, but unfortunately what happened there in North Carolina was a true tragedy, and it's something that we all felt really helpless about. And I know many people around here spent time donating and reaching out and just doing everything that we could do to help our friends and neighbors up there your way in North Carolina, but certainly something that we don't want to forget about. And a lot of need is still in that area. So we're still thinking about y'all up there.
Yeah, and you know, from way over here west of the Mississippi, I'm glad both of you boys are doing well and made it through there. I know, Micah, you were out of power and water and all the modern conveniences for quite some time.
It was 17 days that I went.
Wild.
Yes, indeed. And now, after the flood times, you know, I am making my way back, getting caught up in everything from podcasts and other work to also unboxing in my new home. Here I am in my new studio at the moment. And yeah, it's been a process. Let me be very, very clear. A process of adjusting, a process of coming to terms with the fact that the region, but also many of the businesses in this area have been essentially leveled. The landscape has been changed. It will be looking very different going forward. But, you know, I think we are Southeast strong, North Carolina strong, Asheville strong. We're making progress. But, you know, I do appreciate all the folks who reached out. Many of our listeners were reaching out. I think, unfortunately, and I didn't mean to, but I scared a lot of people because given that I didn't have internet, given that there was virtually no cell reception up here in the mountains during the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, I wasn't able to get online, and I'm not exactly the most active on social media anyway. I have, over the years, learned to keep my head down and remain out of sight. And I'm also just a very busy person, and that's kind of how it was in the days after the flood. I met all my new neighbors here at the new home, which, funny enough, is still in the same general neighborhood that I lived in before, but I was blessed enough right before this storm to be able to buy a house. Yes, I do have home insurance, and it does cover some issues. Not flooding, but fortunately up on the mountainside where I am, flooding was not as severe as it was down the hill and across the street where Cane Creek flows. There were homes that were destroyed, property that was completely destroyed, portions of the road coming to my house completely washed out and destroyed, people as little as maybe 7 minutes away missing. And, in fact, national news covered the story of Craigtown, which was a little community where, again, the residents, many of them lifetime, and in fact, actually several generations going back, of the Craig family had lived up there. A mudslide came through and just completely leveled the entire community. I believe that there were 11 that were initially reported missing, many of those lives lost. And that was just one instance of many throughout this region where the devastation struck. So, I mean, it's been an experience. It has been a learning experience. You know, we have that expression, prepper, that you hear from time to time, people who are always preparing for the next disaster. I've never really considered myself necessarily one of those people, but I had a food supply. I had water. I was much more well prepared than most. But after this experience, let me tell you, I think that the prepper instinct has kicked in. I'm going to be even more well prepared. I now have a generator. I now have a Starlink courtesy of Uncle Elon. I'm going to be working on getting the ham radio license too. So the next time, God forbid, something of this magnitude happens in this region, whether it be weather related or something else, I'm going to be more prepared. And those kinds of experiences, these kinds of tragedies, they can either knock you down and you stay down, or you get back up and you try to push on. And that's what really the entire community has been doing. And I'm so thankful. My neighbors, my friends, the people of Asheville, the people of Western North Carolina have continued on. And we're all learning from this, and we are going to be stronger going forward. So that all said, I won't belabor the point. I personally have talked about this on some of my other podcasts, and I know you guys were checking in daily. I appreciate the concern from both of you and your families, and many of our listeners out there too who have reached out and who have shown support. And I will just say the effort to continue and provide support to the people whose lives have been irreversibly affected by this remains underway. So please consider supporting one of the charities that are collecting donations, not only for those who have been affected by Helene, but also who have been affected in other parts of the United States, especially the Southeast. Right after Helene, we had Milton that struck Florida. There was a lot of devastation down there too. So again, these charities are a good way that people can put money behind the relief effort and help ensure that those who have been affected will get back on their feet soon, and that the next time we'll all be more well prepared when a natural disaster like this strikes. And last thing I'll say, guys, there were immediately comparisons being made between Helene and Katrina. And, people in my community even were saying, oh, come on, Katrina was far more devastating. But as the death count rose, as the number of the missing rose, as the infrastructure damage was fully revealed, indeed, I believe Helene was within a few days called the greatest inland disaster since Katrina. And so again, you can't really make direct comparisons, but certainly it was of a magnitude that was comparable in some ways, especially for an inland disaster and in a region like Western North Carolina up here in the mountains where few would expect that to ever happen. So good to be back behind the microphone and to see both of your smiling faces this evening, gents.
Well, so I think the toll will continue to be counted for some time in North Carolina and the surrounding areas there. And I was going to ask you, you kind of beat me to it, but I was going to ask you about what you learned about prepping through this. When I used to live down in Savannah, we had a few hurricanes, and I think the longest I went without power was about 7 days. And I had a pretty good idea how to prep and how to prepare for that, and it worked out pretty well. But I was just curious. What we talked about, the solar generator, I think you picked up, which is something that's kind of been on my list as well.
Yeah, I decided to go ahead and acquire a solar generator. The logic there, and again, if you really talk with generator purists, they would tell you, well, if it's not driven by gasoline or some other kind of fuel source and it's not able to power your home based on that fuel source, it ain't a generator. But again, one of the things I immediately noticed in my community was that as soon as the power was out and people realized that, commodities were quickly going away, right. Stores were closed, you weren't able to get food, you weren't able to get water, people immediately started going to the gas stations and tanking up, and they were carrying, additional containers, and they were filling up on gasoline. And so I was trying to keep my car topped off, but I was really concerned that Western North Carolina was going to very quickly see a fuel shortage. But I've seen similar instances where a fuel line has been shut down or there's been other issues that affect fuel reaching the region. And when you have to go for several days, not sure when you'll be able to buy gas again, if that's also in the midst of a natural disaster or other circumstances, inclement weather or whatever else, that might take you offline and impact your ability to have power, you're going to need to be able to power a generator, whether or not you can get gasoline. There are other options. Propane is one, natural gas is one, and I do have natural gas at my house. But I thought that the solar option would just be a good idea. And there's another reason for it too. And this actually has to do with the work that SAAJ has done for many years. We've always enjoyed getting out there on the road. We've always enjoyed being able to go out there to archaeology sites. And many of those archaeology sites are really in remote areas. And I thought, well, first of all, it would be nice when we're out there and we're working on a site and we're assisting archaeologists, or if we are in a situation where we might be somewhere and we're doing something up in the mountains, normally where you aren't able to get very good access to power and other supplies. First of all, it would be good to be able to bring some power with me and to be able to charge that out there in the middle of nowhere. So the solar generator was a natural option for that reason. And then the other thing, too, was I thought, you can have power, but it also helps to have communications. And hence, that's where Starlink came into the equation. Now, for those who have been affected by these hurricanes, Starlink, Elon Musk's company, has said, that initially they were just going to give people 1 month free. Now I think in some circumstances they are actually giving people service for free who are affected by the hurricane through to the end of the year. But yet again, imagine SAAJs, even beyond circumstances where I may need these things in my line of work here at my house, and now I'm able to use, solar panels to charge devices. The solar generator I have can be used to charge microwave ovens, an entire kitchen, basically. You can charge your refrigerator, you can charge televisions, lighting, all kinds of things. And if you're able to hook it directly up into your switch box, you can actually power your entire house with a few of these. And of course, they're stackable, so you can run several of these together. Those all seem like good ideas to me, but there's always in the back of my mind that hope that someday SAAJ is going to be able to go out there and be at some really remote location, and now we'll have power and internet while we're there.
Yeah, well, those are certainly always great things to have, but nonetheless, it is something that's a reality. These things do happen, and we are still wrapping up. I'm looking at the weather forecast, and they are still saying that November could potentially produce even more storms on this particular year. So, I think that's a good investment, great thing to have. Nonetheless, here in the Southeast, always active from now until at least the first of the year, the 1st of December, that is. So I'm glad to hear that you have that and that you are setting up there in your new home. And certainly, again, we encourage everyone to get out there, try to volunteer if you can. If not, stay on top of these charities, follow along with there's still a great need. Just because it's not being reported as much in the news, the need is still there. There's still a lot of people who could benefit from donations, from volunteers, and remember, it's happening throughout the Southeast. So again, we thank everybody who has volunteered to this point, and we're just glad to be back with our brothers here tonight. We're glad that Mike is home, is safe, and that he is doing well, and that we got good reports about his family and his friends all safe there in Asheville, North Carolina.
Thank you for saying that, by the way, because you're right. The media has, I'm not going to get in that whole debate about, the falsehoods or the inaccuracies. People, every time I travel, especially outside of state over the last few days, somebody stops me. Wait, you're from Asheville. Well, is the media telling the truth? And I'm like, well, they are, but there are also things that are happening here that simply are not making their way to the media. And it's a really complex dynamic. Trust me, I learned that firsthand being here on the ground, spending the first several days, in fact, traveling up my mountain here and carrying food to people who were stranded and couldn't get out. Going around to the various stores, most of them gas stations that were open at that time and only under, a few hours per day. But I was going to the gas stations and taking supplies to those people because they were there working. But many of them didn't have flashlights, candles, food, things like that. I was delivering food and things to family members, and bits and pieces of information were coming in as I was going around and talking to different people. And immediately it was very clear that the situation on the ground, as quickly as it develops, is definitely very different from what you see reported in the news. There was a lot of concern about the conspiracy things and, things that were being said that were not necessarily true and that were being spread on social media. And again, I was right in the middle of it, and I just know that I can speak to the point that I have experienced some very interesting things. And like you said, Jason, the story is not over yet, even if people aren't hearing about it on the news, especially amid all the other craziness happening in the world right now. And there are still people struggling. So yeah, thank you very much for just mentioning that, this goes on. And even if it's not being reported, we rely very much on the help that people are willing to provide. Fortunately, I'm not directly in need, but many people in my community are, and there are a lot of ways you can help. I would just recommend go online and look for credible charities that you can donate to. And again, we are very, very appreciative of everyone who has reached out. Really quickly, guys, by the way, before we get into our main portion of this show, since we've been off the air for a few weeks now, and we're kind of getting caught up after this crazy summer that we've all had, I do have to talk about one quick news story here. And this is one that, in fact, over at the debrief we covered, a lot of sites have been covering this after the journal iScience published this incredible story of the discovery of human remains in a well that appears now to have been corroborated in an ancient saga from around 1197. And in fact, we've got The Guardian here reporting on this, where they quote Michael Martin of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He was the co-author of this study. He said, "We can never be 100% sure that the remains that we are talking about in this new paper are those of a man described in a saga. But," he says, "the circumstantial and scientific evidence is very convincing. And so in a hypothetical trial, if a jury were presented with the scientific evidence and the text of the saga, I know they would be convinced that we have found the victim." Now, right there, this really illustrates to me the importance of this story, because rarely in archaeology do we have the benefit of having a historical record that appears to corroborate the discovery of, something archaeological, let alone human remains, within an archaeological context like this. But that's exactly what happened. Under this circumstance, the Norwegian city of Trondheim, as it's known today, it was known by a different name back in the Middle Ages, and at one time it was the home of the Norwegian king Sverre Sigurdsson. He rose to power in the late 12th century. Well, during a siege on his castle, according to this 182-verse saga, there was an attempt at one point to try and poison the well there at the castle by throwing a man, his remains, into the well. Lo and behold, during archaeological excavations that occurred later there at the site of this castle, they did find an ancient well. They did find human remains in it. It was some time before they, were able to corroborate what they had found archaeologically with what appears in this 182-verse saga. But it certainly seems to be the case that there is a historical account that describes the events that were, found to have played out, and now which we actually have human remains that seem to support. And as the expert quoted in the article here states, Michael Martin, this kind of information is unique because if you were to provide this to a jury and say, look, here's the evidence that we have in support of the testimony provided in this document, I mean, he is pretty confident that indeed they would actually find the victim and be convinced that this indeed is who this was, and that the story outlined in this saga was true and accurate. Very rare circumstances, maybe not quite so much in Europe. Certainly that's the case here in the United States and really in North and South America in general, given that our historic record doesn't go quite as far back. And so naturally in Europe, being able to corroborate something from the 1100s is a little less extraordinary, maybe, but still pretty darned extraordinary. And I would go so far as to say that this is maybe one of the best archaeology stories I have seen this entire year. James?
Yeah, it's a really good story. And just reading the article here where they quote, I think I may have teased some information out of this. It says they took a dead man and cast him headfirst into the well. Then they piled stones into it until it was full. So they clearly didn't intend for the well to be used. And it sounds like what they were doing was poisoning the groundwater, and all the groundwater, down gradient from that. So it appears they had some knowledge of groundwater movement, and just not simply the well, but the entire area.
Indeed, this would have had wide-reaching effects. So yeah, this is really a truly remarkable archaeology story, and one that also has a historical corollary. We have a bit of a history with many of our listeners out there who have been following our exploits here at SAAJ since we launched, or very shortly thereafter. Now, I don't know if there are any sagas written about us, but Jason, certainly if people do want to follow us online, there are a lot of ways they can do that, and they can also keep up with what you've got cooking over there at the Crosstime Pub, and with all of the endeavors for our Patreon supporters.
Well, Patreon continues to grow. We've added some new episodes of the Green Dragon Book Club here recently, as well as a new interview with Aaron Dieter-Wolf talking about a Peruvian paper that he recently came out with to kind of go along with one of our recent episodes. So again, always adding new content over on Patreon, but we also have a little announcement here tonight. We finally have some 7Ages merchandise for you over on TeePublic. So you can just head over, type in 7Ages podcast. We have 8 designs up there right now, available on all the things you would expect. Coffee mugs, t-shirts, hoodies, all of the things that you would maybe want for the upcoming holiday season. Head on over to TeePublic and type in 7Ages podcast. I will also put that link in the show notes so you can just access it through there as well. But Patreon continuing to grow, so feel free to jump over there, join us there, and then check out everything we have to offer at our TeePublic site.
This is marvelous news. I'm so happy to hear this. It puts me right into the holiday spirit. What else also will put me in the holiday spirit is a physics reference. It's turtles all the way down. At least so they say on Turtle Island, which we're about to rediscover with our guest Taylor Keene when we return right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the Seven Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Taylor Keene. Taylor is a senior lecturer at the Heider College of Business Administration and Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Creighton University. He holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College as well as a Master of Business Administration and Master of Public Administration from Harvard University, where he served as a fellow in the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. Taylor is the author of the book Rediscovering Turtle Island, a First Peoples account of the sacred geography of America, available right now from Inner Traditions Press. A Cherokee Nation citizen, Keene carries the name Bison Mane of the Earthen Bison Clan of the Omaha Tribe, the people who move against the current. Taylor Keene is the founder of Sacred Seed, an NFP to educate and celebrate Indigenous culture. Taylor, welcome to the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our honor. You know, Taylor, first of all, I want to say congratulations on your wonderful new book, Rediscovering Turtle Island. I had heard some buzz about this through different outlets, and so I picked up a copy, and I was actually really surprised at the variety, the plethora of topics that you cover in the book, and I found it to be a very refreshing take on many of the things that I had heard over the years. Again, a beautiful book available now through Inner Traditions. Now, right from the beginning of this book, we are introduced to some very powerful narrative, a story, a myth, if you will, that has a lot of weight for today's world of 2024. And so I want to begin tonight by discussing the prophecy of the seventh generation and what exactly that means for Indigenous cultures here in North America. I had heard pieces of this in the past, but to see it presented so vividly in your book was truly a treat. So tell us a little bit about that prophecy and what it means here in 2024.
Sure. Well, that's this story and prophecy has been talked about a lot by Indigenous peoples. And much like yourself, when I had first heard about it, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And I remember in 2001, when the first of the white buffalo calves were born, and they need to be true albinos. There's a lot of morphs that are not true albinos. That caused a big buzz on the moccasin telegraph, as we would say, just Indigenous peoples chatting and whispering. And I heard lots of different versions. I was living in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and I remember just kind of marveling at what was happening, and I only got bits and pieces and snippets, so I didn't really understand what the story was. What I did understand about the prophecy is that, at least in my neck of the woods, my mother's tribe, the Omahas, were a Siouan people, and I knew it was part of the Siouan mythos. And it has to do with 6 generations of suffering. And one can look at that in multiple different ways, but the way that I typically explain it is with the one thing that you can't get around when talking about Native American history, which is the role of smallpox and other germs and diseases and blights upon Indigenous peoples. And that was such a devastating impact on all of the Americas. whether it was from the most northern portions of Canada or to the southern tip of the Tierra del Fuego in South America, indigenous peoples were equally lacking immunity to this variant of cowpox, which came out of Europe. And while it was devastating to everyone, but in much larger degrees of decimation for indigenous peoples, and probably introduced by the Spanish conquistadors, whoever was coming early. But just like with the pandemic, whatever one's politics are, it doesn't matter how it got here. Once it was here, it was here. And the decimation rates ultimately, conservative estimates are at 50%. And in places like where I'm from, in between the late 1700s and 1860, there were 3 to 4 major waves in the lands we now call Nebraska, and 85 to 95% of the populations died. 95% is what really happened here. And so to explain the magnitude of that for your listeners and readers of the book, I tell everyone, think about 100 of your closest friends and families, mentors, teachers, parents, spouses, nieces, nephews, and you only get to pick 100 just for a round number, and then take away 95 of them, and you're left with 5. And that's what happened to the Americas. So there are accounts from the conquistadors of large populations, whether that be in the Amazon or coming through the American Southeast. And what they first encountered were lots and lots of people. And in most cases, their first attempts were not successful. And they had to return. And when they came back, there was no people. And that's what happened. And it was absolutely devastating. So I typically use that as the starting point for discussing the prophecy. But if that wasn't enough, add on the waves of European settlers, ecocide of bison, elk for the most part, wolves. These are all things that are very important to indigenous peoples that you'll find in our clan structures. And if that weren't enough, major changing of the landscape, loss of prairie lands, to the point now the facts that I know are from close to my area, but how much of the state of Iowa is still prairie? It's less than 1%, and all the rest has been turned into farmlands. And if that weren't enough, all of the important seeds and plants from Europe came over here as invasives, primarily in trees. So you've got, a massive transformation. Somewhere within all of that multiplying, the effect was devastating to indigenous peoples. To imagine everything that you knew about this place was changing in front of your eyes, and you were powerless to stop it because 95% of your tribe, your warriors, your wives, your support structures were gone. And it was indiscriminate, except for the fact that it probably took elders and children in greater degrees. So, the impact is hard to comprehend. But that was where I marked the beginning of the sixth generations of suffering. And the prophecy basically was when there's 4 consecutive albino bison calves born white buffalo calves, then that would mark the era of the 7th generation. I just happened to be working on a scholarly paper with a legal scholar who was Dakota, but also a spiritual leader. And when the 4th one was born, I was in a meeting with her, and I remember asking him a bunch of naive questions about the prophecy. I saw that the 4th bison was born. Yes, she said. So does that mean that this is now the time for the 7th generation? Yes. Does that mean that we're the 7th generation? And the answer was pretty curt, no. And what followed was addressing down culturally that while I had been very well educated in white man's ways, I didn't know all of my stories. And she was right. And that's the impetus for the book and the backdrop, because it's incumbent upon the fifth and the sixth generations previous to teach the seventh. And I didn't know all my stories. And that was the beginning. And so it took me a while to kind of come around to figuring out what I wanted to do, but I left the corporate world and went to the world of being a professor, and eventually decided that I needed to turn all of it into something that was a vehicle for transferring some of this knowledge. And the only way that I knew how to do it was to write a book. And so the seventh generation prophecy has great significance for our time now. I think as human beings, we all think that this is the best of times and the worst of times. Many people view our world as more disparate and disagreeing than ever. I think all humans think that, but with a world of perfect information, that becomes a lot easier to disagree. And so for Indigenous peoples, the seventh generation, they're going to be the leaders to help lead our nations to stand tall again, and inferences of a cultural revitalization. And I see that today all around Indigenous country. With respect to the non-Indigenous seventh generation, is equally as important, because they're the ones who are finally going to be ready for Indigenous wisdom. So when you talk about the book being a lot of things, I joke seriously that it's probably 3 different kinds of books, 1/3 of the way written, but it's how I began to think about things, and things that were, first things to come to mind that were very important. It's just the way that my mind worked. So we start the book with cosmogenesis, talking about our creation stories. And I like that you use the word myth, because that has a lot of significance coming from Greek mythos. And I've ultimately, I think one of my goals for a second work is to be able to translate Indigenous myth in a way that the Greeks have done it, because when you look at our language and our words, whether it's cosmos or mythos, that's all Greek. And it has to do ultimately with humans looking up to the sky and the stars in the heavens and trying to figure out their movements into stories. And that goes for the ancient Greeks. The Romans did their own interpretation, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and I think it's time for Indigenous peoples to tell their own stories. So that's the sort of backdrop for how I began to approach things. And I started with our creation story. Begin with the beginning.
Begin with the beginning. You're exactly right. And I think, the book, as you said, is many different things, but it's a great starting point for these discussions. Now, I always want to understand things like when we talk about the 6 generations of suffering, is there any explanation as to why that suffering was necessary?
No, that's just the way that Creator and Spirit had things planned. One of the things that I really wanted to do with the book was to try to explain how we think. Oftentimes I'll begin these types of conversations by saying what to me seems like one of the absolute truths is Indigenous peoples are the most misunderstood thing in America. And everything from how we view the world, but more importantly, our sort of perceived role as this romantic savage is something that I can't escape every day of my life. Somebody says to me, one part of it, it's either there were nomads living on the plains, kind of simpletons, or that, you guys had it right. And the reality, as with all truths, is somewhere in between all of those conversations. But the narrative passed down through literature and Hollywood and mass media is always oversimplified. but it comes down to trying to explain our conception of the world. And it's not within my view of Indigenous thought to even question why. It's not like it's, I think so much of our society in America is seen through the lens of the Judeo-Christian, because you have a vengeful God at times. And so there's punishments. And Indigenous peoples, first of all, we're not in the Bible. It's unclear where we really come from, our story, which is one of the things I wanted to look at with the book. But we view time not as linear, but as circular and moving in ages and epochs, and that everything happens for a reason. And some people would oversimplify that and criticize and say that we're fatalist. I've heard that before, and it's just the way that it is, and we all have a role to play in here. So I don't look upon the 6 generations of suffering as a punishment, but that was the reality of what happened to us. And it became very important to me at a certain point to learn the history first, to learn the stories, and then try to understand how it all fits together.
Taylor, I don't want to miss this opportunity. We have many topics that we're going to attempt to address here tonight, but you mentioned that this misunderstanding occurs to you so often. And so you said Indigenous people here in North America being the most misunderstood. So what is the reality? I know you can't speak for, every tribe member and every group, but what is the reality in 2024 for someone like yourself, someone that, other people in your tribe? What is that reality that people aren't understanding?
Well, like I was mentioned before, a lot of it is an oversimplification or romanticization of what our ideals are without understanding. And there's this belief that, we were sort of wild children of the earth, sort of. And that's what I hear all the time. And that's what most people, they have that simplified, generic impression. In reality, most people don't know the role of smallpox. People don't understand the history of what happened with the treaties and how this land was truly stolen unethically, and that the founding fathers were a major part of that. So that was one of the things I wanted to address with the book, is let's just get some facts down here. And then once we get past that, and then we can discuss how Indigenous people look at the world. And that's the portions around thinking red and living red. And I was very careful in writing the book to say that it's really important in this, that, the world needs Indigenous peoples to do this. Every day I look somewhere online and find some forum on social media where some non-Indigenous person is speaking on behalf of the elders. And, I'm faced with this stuff every day, and that's not going to help, because you're missing the whole point. We're still here. We have perspectives, and many of us have taken on a more serious role of trying to understand and be honest and factual, and we're telling of that history, and we can tell our own. So that's the caveat, is that that's why I appreciate being asked to come on your show, because I do think it's important for Indigenous peoples to express these things and not have someone say, well, I've met a Hopi elder and here's what they really believe. I mean, 99% of the time, none of that is true. And there's also some things that are sacred to Indigenous peoples. I was very careful in the book not to put up any images or talk about things that I shouldn't talk about, because we do have our things that we hold sacred, in some sense secret. And but there was plenty to share, so I thought it was important. And I'm sure by some Indigenous peoples I would be criticized for even writing about some of these things, but I think it's important, and it was a vehicle that I knew would get out there. Once you write a book, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to whoever reads it. And it was my hope, just like I had a deep impression from writers like Vine Deloria and leaders like John Trudell, leaders of the Red Power movement back in the late 1960s and early 70s. Dr. A.C. Ross, who wrote Matonkwiyasi, We Are All Related, and that came out in the early 90s when I was getting out of college. Those things had such an impression upon me, and it was my hope that my book someday, long after I'm gone, somebody's going to find it and they're going to take it and build upon it, whether that's understanding more of the stories or how they're all connected, or archaeoastronomy and what I put into the book. Some of it's tedious to follow, but that was on purpose for the seventh generation, for them to see this is the type of work you have to do if you really want to understand what we did in the past. It's a lot more complicated and much deeper in terms of mathematics and astronomy and measuring time and working the land than we could ever imagine. So there is a lot in there.
Yeah, and Taylor, that pays homage to those that came before, of really understanding the degree to which they, had the ability to design these earthworks, to design all of these things planetarily, cosmically, mathematically, and again, just getting rid of that old stereotype of what people perceive that was given to us from places like Hollywood and movies and television, but really beginning to understand just how in-depth and complicated many of these areas and structures were over time. Now, a couple other quick things here. You talked about the coming of the seventh generation, and you mentioned the fourth bison, albino bison, being born. Other than that very clear sign, what are you seeing among your own people and people throughout the indigenous tribes throughout all of America, North America, Central America, South America? Are they all following this prophecy? And what is the outlook for the coming years as far as what is to be expected?
I can only speak for what I know is right around me. I certainly don't speak for all indigenous peoples, and all indigenous peoples have their own prophecies. I know the ones that have affected my life, and that's all that I can speak for. But cultural revitalization around language, around history, food sovereignty, seed sovereignty, an understanding of protecting what is sacred with land and water, the battles with the pipeline companies and how that's awakened a lot of youth. And it's happening all around us, and indigenous peoples are starting to think a lot more abstractly about what has colonization done to us. And for me, it's an opportunity to become post-colonial, meaning quit living with the structures that were handed by the colonial powers, meaning redo our constitutions, voice our perspectives on sacred geography and what we called it and the stories that came from it. So much more interesting than the colonial models. For example, Devil's Tower. It was a mistranslation of what basically an Indian agent heard from tribal peoples. And there was that bent that anything that was indigenous sacred was from the devil. It was that early puritanical perspective, and that's happened all over the place. Whereas you have the story of the seven sisters and being chased by their brother who spent too much time with the giants, and their medicine changed him into a giant bear, and he chased them. And the creator instructed those seven girls to go to the great tree stump of the great tree of life. And from there, he elevated them to the stars for safety from the giant bear. And there's so much more beauty in those stories. And the provenance can only enhance the perspective of America and all the sacred geography that's here. And we're slowly getting that across. I've always been impressed by the beauty that I saw in the indigenous world around me, and now it's time, for people like me to try to share that beauty and what we've seen and translate it to others.
No, I couldn't agree more. Those are great points all around. Now, I want to use tonight's discussion to make sure that we bring up some of the influences that you've had, and also some of those indigenous authors, writers, activists, to get their name out there as well, so that other people can discover what they have done in the past. Tell me a little bit about Vine Deloria Jr., DeWard Walker. What was their role and what was their influence on you as far as writing this book and getting to where you're at today?
Well, I'd mentioned in 2001, I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and one of the reasons I wanted to go there was that was sort of the hotbed of a lot of indigenous intelligentsia at the time. Some were at University of Colorado Boulder, like DeWard Walker. DeWard is a father figure to me and the chair emeritus of the anthropology department at CU Boulder. And DeWard was the one who turned me on to sacred geography, because that was a part of his work. And when I was studying some anthropology while I was at Dartmouth College in Native American Studies, I was often at odds with the anthropologists. First of all, there was a pompousity that really bothered me, because here is some white guy telling me how Indians were supposed to be. And it was just full of a perspective that I didn't care for. And DeWard was not like that at all. He was not a collector of things. He didn't have his own collection that he kept, through his journeys. As a matter of fact, there was just a few things in his home, and they were gifts to him, honoring him from, people who would create something for him. And the reason why is all the work that he did for indigenous peoples, and he still does. DeWard's in his 80s now, and made a lifetime of working with the tribes and whatever they needed help with. He did a lot of stuff around indigenous rights, American Indian religious freedom type stuff, helping protect sacred geography, working on lawsuits with tribes, those who were trying to figure out what lands were once theirs and trying to get them back again. And so DeWard is one of the good guys from anthropology, and he's kicked me in the pants a number of times over the years. He was the one who turned me on to understanding what was happening with some of the big ag and seed companies that were basically in other countries were displacing indigenous farmers and their seed with their GMO crops, and was concerned that it was going to affect Native America. And that was probably right around 2007 or so, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, when he turned me on to that. And now you see indigenous peoples all around embracing seed sovereignty and getting back to planting their own Three Sisters, just as I started 10 years ago. And I give DeWard credit for doing that. Also at CU Boulder was Vine Deloria, and I did have the honor of meeting Vine. And there was a number of other people in the Boulder community. Walter Echohawk Sr., his brother John at the Native American Rights Fund. They were very kind to me personally and professionally, and I interned there when I was in college, and just all those folks were around. But Vine was the guy, because he had written so much and had such a pivotal role as a leader of the National Congress of American Indians too. But it was all of his works that I explored. The titles of them are just iconic. Custer Died for Your Sins was the political manifesto. And when I first read that, I tried to read it in college, and I didn't get it at all. I viewed it as a political manifesto but I couldn't understand what they were celebrating. not too long after I read God is Red, and I didn't get it then either. And I picked both back up in my 30s and started understanding a little bit more, but it wasn't until my 40s when I finally went back and read them again and said, how could I not have seen this in my youth? But ultimately, especially in God is Red, what I thought was a celebration of sort of protesting that he discussed in Custer Died for Your Sins, what I realized was what he was highlighting was a celebration of sacred geography, and that sacred geography was at the core of American Indian religion. And the places that he was referring to in his first book, yes, they were protesting, but what they were really trying to protect was the sacred waters or the sacred mountains or the sacred lands that their people had been taught to. And that was a whole different understanding. That's where I began to understand the notion of time as being circular and what I learned from Vine. And there's a number of references in the book, some of the quotes that are in there, just the way that he looked at our history and our culture was very impactful for me. So all of those folks had an influence. John Trudell was another one who was one of the political leaders of the American Indian movement in their sort of non-militant phase, even though he suffered such great injustices. He was a poet and a brilliant thinker, and I just learned so much from him. I still go back to his interviews and quotes. At a certain point, someone was, again, back to that misstereotyping that we see so often. Somebody was questioning his indigeneity as an urban person because Indians are supposed to live on the reservation or in the woods or some other nonsense. And his answer back, and I'm paraphrasing, but he was like, you're missing the point. The indigenous mind seeks to understand their environment around them, wherever they are, and their relationship to time and space and place. And what part of urban living do you disagree with? Is it the pavement? Is it the cement? Is it the steel? All those things come from the mother. And it's just those kind of perspectives that had a big impact on me and other people from my age. And so I just tried to, I used the book and the platform to try to share some of those wonderful things that had impressions upon me, and using those to help explain to others about who we are as Indigenous peoples. And like I said, I'm no spokesperson for all Indigenous peoples. I just know my experience and like to share it.
Well, that is very, very powerful. Those statements that you just gave us just gives us insight into the way that he's describing a whole different method of thinking about the world and the environment. And I think that's beautiful. And speaking of things that are beautiful and carry a lot of weight and a lot of influence, in the cosmogenesis portion of the book, so many very interesting things there, myths, stories, parables, all from the indigenous cultural view. But there's one particular, the Earth Diver mythos. Now, this was, again, something that was new to me. I love this sort of thing from all cultures, but I had never heard of this particular one, and I found it to be very, very powerful, and I think it is something that would really resonate with our audience. So, Taylor, let's begin our discussion on the Earth Diver mythos. What is it, and what role does that play as far as passing along that cultural heritage?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I often say is when you're discussing an Indigenous perspective, stories are everything. But that goes for all of humanity and history. If you want something to be permanent, it needs to be compelling enough to be remembered and retold, first of all, and more often than not, needs to be able to be explained to someone of any age. And we think of the parables of Jesus or the teachings of Muhammad or Buddha, and they're all the same. And so much of the indigenous perspective that's not been fleshed out by popular culture. And I've heard variations of this story. One that I share in the book was just one of the versions that I had heard. And that's a part of explaining all this, because one of the things that I've heard over the years when sharing the story is that many indigenous peoples have these stories, and there are truths, and it forms a connection, whether that be Siouan speaking tribes, Algonquin speaking tribes, Iroquoian tribes. We all have different variations. Some of the Iroquois and Algonquin have woman who falls from the sky, different variations. Ultimately, it comes down to, it's a story of cosmogenesis. Where do we come from? And ultimately, it tells our journey from the Seven Sisters constellation of Pleiades through the dark rift of the Milky Way and what we call the journey of the souls, which is probably the most important symbolism, talking about coming and going back to heaven, to put it in modern terms, and how we got here. So if it was okay, I was going to tell a version of this and then explain what I learned, where this came from, and why there's so many variations.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Taylor. Please do so.
In the beginning, our souls were like stars in the sky, thought, but no form. Eventually, one of these souls, a question came to it, and the question burned inside of the star, the soul. Who am I? And so the soul with the burning question went to its mother, the moon, and said, "Mother, who am I?" "Oh, my child," she said, "I've been worried that this time would come. You need to take that question and ask it of your father. Hurry." So the soul, the star, goes to his father, the sun. And at this point, that establishes part of where we come from, that all things maternal are from the moon and all things paternal are from the sun. And that goes through so much of our symbolism and our cosmology. The star, the soul, asks his father, the sun, "Who am I?" And its father immediately chastised the young soul star and said, "My child, be very careful with that question, because that question, who am I, is the most important question we have as a soul." But that star, that soul, is just like us today, hard to keep a secret. And soon that question was asked by not just him, but three others. My mother's tribe, the Omahas, say that we do everything in fours, including our journey through as souls to here and then back home. Then we move in fours. And soon there were four of them. And with that question being asked, they all embarked upon the journey of the souls together. And when they arrived on this planet, it was covered in water. And they transmuted from stars their souls into the forms of animals. And here's where you have the variations of the story. The version that resonated with me is the Gian Siouan. So it's just part of the language family. And there's many different variations. But in that story, there was otter and deer and a waterfowl, sometimes a duck, some tribes say a swan, and then turtle. And ultimately, three of the animals discover that they're made for the water, but there is one that is not. In this case, it's the deer. And so turtle volunteers to dive down into the waters, noticing the wonderful gifts that Creator had endowed this form of a turtle. And so its paws were webbed and could hold its breath and survive in the water and dive and rise. And the waterfowl noticed the gifts from Creator Its feet too were made for the water, but its feathers and plumes allowed it to float on the water, and its wings allowed it to fly. And so Turtle instructed the waterfowl to go out and make big concentric circles to the 4 directions to try to find something. And Turtle, while courageous, was slow. And eventually Otter had stayed with the deer to help deer. And eventually they both came back. The waterfowl came in and landed on the water, and Turtle came up, and they both didn't have anything to show. And so they were getting concerned, because what they could remember was the only thing that they could remember from their previous world were the core values that still remain with Indigenous peoples. We are all related. Water is life. Be good to one another. Be kind. Be respectful. Help one another. And that's all that they could remember. So they knew that they needed to help the deer. And so at the last ditch effort, the otter says, Creator gave me this beautiful form, this wonderful fur, which is made for the water and allows me to dive into the cold depths, and this powerful tail. Let me go. And so it did. So the otter dives down into the primordial waters. And just when they were about to give up hope, when they thought that the deer couldn't make it any longer, then up from the depths, they see the otter coming with clutching something close to its chest. And as he comes out, he has the clay of earth. Turtle felt so bad for getting them into all of this. The turtle sacrificed itself, took the primordial clay, put it on its back, and that's where the land comes from. That's why we call it Turtle Island. So the way that I was taught was the island is alive, and our drums, symbolic of the heartbeat. As long as we sing and use our drums, then Turtle's going to continue to live. And so stories are powerful, and I can tell that to younger children, and they get it. They associate with the animals. And what I soon discovered, was even within my own tribes, within Cherokees, there's different variations of that story, including which animal dives down into the depths. And I've shared that story with other Indigenous peoples, and oftentimes I'll hear comments like, you almost got that right, Taylor, but you're missing one thing, or you got the wrong animal. And what I realized, besides the fact that all humans in our tribal structures think that we're right, but in essence, we are all right, because that is a very old story. And as I began to research it, I found a Russian scholar who specialized in the earth diver myth, and it originates from Siberia. So when we're talking about the antiquity of Indigenous peoples, classical anthropological thought limited it to the Bering Strait theory somewhere between 12 and 15,000 years ago. Well, now footprints in limestone and white sands in New Mexico push that back to 23,500 years. The work of Dr. Paulette Steeves in the Indigenous Paleolithic. Who knows how long it's going to take, but there are sites out there, and that window is slowly getting pushed back beyond 25,000 years and probably closer to 100,000. So it's, either way, migrations of Indigenous peoples to the Americas out of Asia and Siberia definitely happened during the Pleistocene, and more than likely had to survive, if not get here, while there was an ice sheet over half of the Americas. So the story gets much more complicated. And all those variations are another indication of how long that story's been here. Because like languages, those stories only mutate with time. And so that has become so much more iconic to me as I understand the complexity and the history and the depth of antiquity that it took for that story to have all these different variations. So beginnings are very important. And that is one of the stories of beginnings of how people got here.
Well, it's a beautiful story, to say the least. It's very striking, and it also rings to many other cultures. It reminds me very much of the creation story that the ancient Egyptians share of the Nun waters and of the monad, the dirt rising up out of the waters, the primordial waters. I couldn't help but sort of make that connection as you were telling that beautiful story. But it also, again, makes that sort of deep antiquity connection. And I think it's very interesting, those little similarities that are shared. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. You have mentioned here at the beginning of that misunderstanding of indigenous culture, and we talked about the influence of things like smallpox and all of those things that were so devastating, to say the least. But there was also something that people may not be as aware of called the doctrine of discovery. And this was a very, very powerful political implementation that needs to be understood and needs to be discussed. So just briefly, the doctrine of discovery was established as a religious, political, and legal justification for colonization and seizure of land here in North America. It really had so much influence and so much power, but in the wrong direction. It was something that was made for anybody who was not of the Christian faith. So let's talk a little bit about the doctrine of discovery. Who was the architect of this and what it meant for indigenous people here in North America?
Well, by talking about doctrine of discovery in what has become the United States of America, we have to understand where that came from. And we have to look to European colonial models first, and whether that was influence of the French, Spanish, or British notions of doctrine of discovery. I think legally, the original adaptation into the Marshall Trilogy in the 1830s was the first time that it was truly cemented, because if there wasn't a justification, then international law in the form of treaties would reign supreme. And so there had to be some theory. If not, then who knows legally whether or not people could actually hold title to something that they had stolen. So in the end, someone had to figure out that model. And what I identify in the book is the role of Thomas Jefferson as the architect of dispossession. So in it, there's lots of smoking guns. I included the ones I thought that were the most deft to get through. There was lots of different perspectives that he said, but ultimately he started off very, always paternalistic, but sometimes altruistic as a leader. And as the pressures and the hunger for land and more immigrants came in, that tone changed to, if they, aren't going to sign the treaties, then let's engage and trade with them, get them indebted to us, which is a page out of the European colonial models. And once they're indebted to us, they'll have to give us the land. And so you see in rapid succession, but virtually, literally, every treaty that the United States did with tribes, they violated. And eventually that had to be cleaned up from a legal perspective. And that's where in the Marshall Trilogy, I believe it's in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. I'm not a legal scholar, so I may have which one is wrong, but that's where Chief Justice Marshall, or whoever wrote the majority opinion, introduced that in to clear things up, that the doctrine of discovery was the reigning legal theory that cleaned up everything else. And by the fact that through a sovereign crown, meaning anointed by some religious leader, probably going back to the papal edicts and the Catholic Church as the model. And I cite a lot of that in the book too, the perspectives where it said it was okay to go and take these lands because the world's a better place with more Christians. So you can go do it. And that all had to be tied up. And ultimately, that's why they brought their priests and religious leaders with them. So as soon as they landed on the ground, they were anointed by God to take the land.
No, that's well put, and that's a great explanation. It's something, again, that is overlooked, something that doesn't get the attention. In fact, most people probably have never even heard of this, but yet it had such an impact on the indigenous communities, but yet often so overlooked. So again, this is a key part of the book, and that's just one of many, many things that you will find here in Rediscovering Turtle Island. Again, this book is available now. Now, there is one more area I really want to touch on before we conclude here tonight, Taylor, and that is Cahokia. Cahokia is something that we have done shows on in the past. Hopefully, everybody listening here should be at least somewhat familiar with that immensely huge and important site. But you chose to highlight Cahokia, and you give it its just due. So talk a little bit about what is it about Cahokia that resonates with you and why you included it in the book to the degree that you did.
Well, this gives me an opportunity to talk about another one of your previous guests, Tim Pocketat. And he also had a great impression upon me amongst other anthropologists and archaeologists. One of the things that really changed my world was somewhere right around 2009, I believe, is when he published his work on Cahokia. And it was the first time that I had heard a perspective where he included indigenous oral traditions with what he was doing, and a tone of respect for indigenous peoples in a way that I had not really seen before. And I've since understood the work of and the impact of indigenous archaeologists like Robert Hall and others who came in and basically urged the field through their work to include things that were more soft sciences than the hard sciences of anthropology, meaning stories. And without stories are everything. How could you get it right? You can't get it right without that. And he also had a perspective that I recall saying, we don't need to dig anymore. There's more than enough information out there, whether it's railroads or highways or construction projects. All these things have been documented, because that's one of the problems that indigenous peoples have is why do you feel like you need to dig up our dead? Why does this need to be discovered? That's part of the problems. And he had such an impact on me and understanding this. Basically, it was a great urban experiment in indigenous countries in the Americas 1,000 years ago. And it incorporates so many things. One is how many people actually went there. So things began probably, there were certainly communities living there around 900, but by around 1,000, things began to change and it went into a growth mode. There was a supernova of the Crab Nebula in 1054. Anytime that there's bright stars in the sky, humans pay attention. So we think of the birth of Jesus, and I'm sure there's multiple other commonalities, universal themes around stars in the sky. For a supernova to hang as the brightest star in the sky for weeks, if not maybe even longer, months, that would give an incredible richness to the spiritual experience, especially when our entertainment theater was the sky. Before there was series to binge upon and movie theaters to go to, we had the stars. And I think just as the ancient Greeks and Sumerians and Egyptians looked to the stars, indigenous peoples did as well. And that's where this story that became a part of the religion was shared widely. You can't talk about Cahokia, at least from my perspective, without talking about Picture Cave, because that's where the ancestors of the Omahas were around the same time. And Picture Cave is in an undisclosed location because one, it's privately held, and two, is the sanctity of it. but it's a series of caves where all of these stories that were being told at Picture Cave were immortalized into rock art and petroglyphs and paintings inside of these caves. Ultimately, when we look at calling something civilization, I use this as an opportunity to redefine things. Civilization is the union between mass, food, and religion. Where those two things come together, people come. And so, besides the beautiful architecture that was turned into earthenworks, flat top pyramidal mound structures, and most of them have been destroyed. 90% of the mounds out there were destroyed by farming, agricultural tilling, highways, people with a lack of respect who destroyed them on purpose. So what we have left is some of the iconic structures, but it's not before it was, someone tried to develop it. The Grand Mound on the Grand Plaza at Cahokia is known as Monk's Mound because at some point there were some white monks living there, and so people said, let's call it that because we rediscovered it. And so, but now it's because of work from people like Tim Pocketat and other anthropologists who have really dove deep into this. It's really helped people like me help retell the history. Yes, there were corn, bean, and squash being grown there, but there was so much more a part of this union between humans and understanding their landscape with plants and animals and fish in a way that fed all the people that came. At its peak, there was 15 to 20,000 at the city center and arguably 150 to 200,000 in the surrounding communities. I include Picture Cave as an example of some of the peoples that were living within the orbit. Picture Cave is somewhere within 100 miles of Cahokia, but could certainly be visited at seminal times of the year for sure. As I was going through all of it, it was easy to, there's a number of good anthropological works out there. And ultimately, I knew there were going to be some tedious details with some of the other earthenworks in the book explaining archaeoastronomy. But in the end, you have to understand the science to understand how it happens. But all that got translated into the story. So at a certain point, I threw out a lot of the direct anthropological references where it inspired me to tell a story. I cited it, but that's the true indigenous tradition, is to turn it into a story. So I took what I knew from my tribal worlds and put it into the story of Hanga, which I believe is a very important ancient mystical name that at one point was the name of our combined Daguian tribes 1,000 years ago. Some interpretations of that word say from whom we all descend from. So I thought that'd be a great name for a leader who comes as a visitor and a pilgrim, as it were, on a pilgrimage to the site, and what he sees and understands and the different roles that he has. And all of it was influenced by things that I learned from the field of anthropology, but it has to do with our iconic pantheon deities and heroes and gods, basically, and turn that into a story. And he's propelled as a kind of a member of the police forces at one point, the Cahokian Guards, which there are carvings of that show the brutality of what was happening there, parts of the uniforms that they wore, to the game that was played there. And there's other carvings in Flintstone of Chunky, and it's a game that's still played by southeastern tribes and others, I'm sure. Has to do with a beautiful little rolling disc that was rolled and spears or darts were thrown at it. And I learned from the field of anthropology that before Cahokia, there were a lot of these independent fields where Chunky was played, but during the Cahokian Empire, it became the royal sport. And so another opportunity for Hanga to rise in society is to become superstar of the Chunky's game, and which he does. And then ultimately he becomes more mystical and spiritual, which is based off of another carving from that era. And ultimately he achieves his reality as becoming the dynastic leader. And what he sees is the story that was being told there, which is behind the religion, the stories of first father and first mother and the first humans, and ultimately the son who becomes known as Redhorn, and the understanding of the tree of life and the tripartite realms of our universe, the upper, the lower realm, and the creation of the middle realm where we reside. The role of the thunderbirds, the messengers of the thunder beings of the upper realm. The role of water spirits in the lower watery realm, which is tied to agriculture. Chief amongst the water spirits is the underwater panther or the underwater serpent, the great serpent itself. Ultimately, the stories of Redhorn and or his sons, the Thunder Twins, and their interactions in the upper realm and the lower realm, and with giants and water spirits and all the stories that go along with it. So I use that as an example of what he witnesses while he's first visiting there, and tells that story, and it is as powerful and as rich and as beautiful as any Greek hero myth and tragedy. And I try to share some of those in the stories about Cahokia, and there's more and more, and hopefully that's some of the stories I'm going to tell in the next work I do. I want to give more flesh to the indigenous pantheon of mythos.
No, it's a brilliant way of tying this together and also making it understandable and palatable for people who haven't heard these things before. Now, you did talk about Picture Cave and you mentioned Redhorn. So just to give a little bit more idea, even though it is in an undisclosed location, there is a book out there, Picture Cave, Unraveling the Mysteries of the Mississippian Cosmos, and that was edited by Carol Diaz Granados, as well as James Duncan and F. Kent Riley III. That book really focuses on the details of Picture Cave, but what is it that we find in the cave, and how does it relate back to what you wrote about concerning Cahokia?
Well, one is the stories I was just telling you about first father and first mother, and all of those are detailed in some sense, and there's so much rich symbology, and I was very fortunate to be able to work with Carol and ask her for permission to use some of the images and the opportunity to engage in conversation. And because I know there's going to be more indigenous peoples who are going to be doing more of this type of work. And well, it's not my field of study or discipline. I've hope that I've been a good student of the field and have represented their work accurately. And more importantly, I've been able to hopefully add a whole new level of interpretation to their anthropological work. Because in the end, the one thing that I could do that they could not, as not being indigenous people themselves in many cases, is that I could employ what I knew of the oral traditions, which is an art form, and to take what I learned from their work and turn it into stories. And I finally realized that indigenous lens of interpretation is the one thing that I could do that's not been done before, and could add a level of accuracy and interpretation or color to what's been done by a scientific field. And hopefully I've been successful in that. And I hope there's a lot more of it, that indigenous peoples everywhere can study these things, don't have to be restricted by the academy to do so, can teach yourself how to understand it and use it accurately, and use it to help promote the real history of Turtle Island and the Americas.
No, what a noble cause. We've been speaking tonight with Taylor Keene, the author of Rediscovering Turtle Island, a First Peoples account of the sacred geography of America. So before we conclude tonight, Taylor, I've learned so much here tonight, but I know that you have other irons in the fire. Tell us about Sacred Seed. I want to know about the goals, the programs, and the impact. So give us all the details of Sacred Seed and how people can learn more about that organization.
Sure. So again, Sacred Seed was born out of a kick in the pants by Dr. Deward Walker. The question when he called me up out of the blue one day was, "Young man, what are you doing to protect your corn?" And I was like, "Corn? What? Do what, Deward?" He said, "Your tribal corn. What are you doing to protect it?" And it took me a few years to figure it out, but eventually that turned into what is Sacred Seed. And most of it has evolved. At a certain point, I had contemplated doing a seed bank, and I certainly have a lot of cool indigenous seeds. But I try to stick to the things that are from my tribes and my area, and to promote the work of other seed keepers around. And ultimately, while I always plant the Three Sisters in some fashion, in some form, I've had big gardens and backyards where I lived to no gardens and gardens other places and seed ambassadors who help me. But ultimately, it's around the education of it. That's the important part. And it was always meant to be a companion to the research for the book and the prophecy, because ultimately you can't get around food and agricultural lifeways that has so much to do with the evolution of humanity all around the world, especially as people who may have been nomadic now had a different world to reside in. And when you're dependent upon the land and weather to be kind to you, and enough rain and not too much rain and not too much wind, and enough sun and not too much sun, all those things probably make you look to God and the gods, depending on the perspective, to get those things there. So to me right now, the work of Sacred Seed, while I always love to go out to gardens and plant places, it's more important to understand the history of indigenous ag and its applications and why it's important and what people can learn from those methodologies today. Central to it is you can't get around the fact that if you study ancient indigenous ag methods, that's often translated into terms like regenerative ag and sustainable ag. And whenever I find a lot of those, I always challenge people and say, whatever it is you're looking at, maybe some of it comes from Europe, but if you look at the history of indigenous ag in America, you're going to find all those things: companion planting, rotating, the use of animals and trees and other things as a part of what has become a monocrop type of culture in American farming. So we have but to look at the past. So that's the serious part of it. But it's all tied, to the stories of, say, first woman, Cherokees, we call her Mother Corn. She is the keeper and bearer of seeds, of old bones that want to return to the journey of souls, to help the soul make it back home to the Seven Sisters. The cosmology is intertwined. So I take Sacred Seed as the opportunity to marry what I have learned from our indigenous oral traditions to the anthropological record out there, and ultimately our relationship to earth and sky and water. And so Sacred Seed has evolved into an educational narrative. And typically, me as one person, it turns out that I need to write books and do podcasts to share it. And that's become the work of Sacred Seed. But I'm always out there. It's that time of year. Corn's pollinating right now. I'm in some garden somewhere, always helping to harvest or looking at things and explaining and helping people learn how indigenous peoples used to grow things and why that's important today. But thanks for asking that question.
Absolutely. Well, the garden is a great place to be. It's one of my favorite spots as well. You can find out more about that at sacredseed.org, and there's plenty of information there for you. Before we conclude tonight, Taylor, just tell everyone where they can find your book. Once again, it is Rediscovering Turtle Island, a First Peoples account of the sacred geography of America. So where can they get the book, and how can people follow along with your work?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, the work is published by Inner Traditions Press, and it's distributed by Simon & Schuster. So pretty much wherever you go to buy books, you can find it. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books Online. An easy place people can go to is the website for the book, www.rediscoveringturtleisland.com, and you'll find links for all of that. But wherever you buy books, if you want to purchase from a local bookstore, go in and ask them to carry it, and they will. Audio version on Audible and other sites. I did the narration of the book, which was a lot of work. And there's also an electronic copy for your Kindle or however you look at electronic books. So it's out there now.
Well, there you have it, folks. All the ways that you can find this great new book, and also follow along at sacredseed.org. Taylor, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a true honor to have you on the show, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime in the future.
Listen, thank you for having me. I'd love to come back.
Jason, always a fantastic job interviewing Taylor Keene right there. And of course, information about Taylor can be found in the show notes accompanying this episode. Don't forget, of course, also you can follow us online. There's also quite a discussion happening over there on our Facebook group. And there's always imagery to see on Instagram. So, gents, we're back on the mic after so long. I'm at least partially back on the mic. I think immediately following this experience, I'm going to be going back down the hall and continue the ongoing unboxing here at my new abode. But maybe before I do that, let's pony up for one more round at the Cross Time Pub. What do you say?
I'll set them up and you knock them down.
That's right. That's what I like to hear. Well, gentlemen, on behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks. We're always glad to bring you the very best in archaeology and history. And of course, we hope to see you again. Keep in touch with us out there on social media. Follow us online at SAAJ.org. And once again, we'll see you guys next time somewhere out there in time here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.